Hey, 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 it's the Comics Kid 2099, and I am back once again to review Young X-Men Books of Revelations. Now, right off the bat, I don't know why this book is titled that. At no point in this book is there an actual book in the story that reveals something to the characters. I mean, I guess you could say this book reveals stuff to us, but the name of the arc is extremely stupid, and it needs to be called something else. Anything else. Maybe this is supposed to have some sort of resonance with a previous trade, which was called Final Genesis. So I guess, biblically, you got Genesis, the first book of the Bible, and then Revelations, the very last book of the Bible. But then, why are you doing that? None of the characters presented here are Christians of any kind, so they wouldn't actually have any reason to call this book Genesis or Revelations. The only character that I'm aware of that has any kind of religion of any kind is Dust, and she's actually a Muslim. So she wouldn't have any connection to the book of Genesis or the book of Revelations in a Bible that is predominantly used by Christians. It's just a really weird thing. I don't understand it at all. And that was just a nitpick. I've been told that I should always try to start a review with a positive thing, but unfortunately, I strove and I could not find anything positive about this entire series, especially this volume, which is just really, really packed with lots of bad. Actually, there is one thing about this book I like. It's actually the first issue that's collected here. It's issue 6 of the series, and if you saw my previous video, the previous 5 issues were basically all there to set up this team, and then show the big twist that Donald Pierce had actually set up the team while he was disguised as Cyclops, and then he basically failed in his mission to kill the old New Mutants. So issue 6 shows a framing device of kind of the aftermath of that, what's going on, who's going to stay, who's going to leave, and it also shows Dani Moonstar, one of the mentors of this new team of kids, and she's trying to recruit someone else. And I thought this was a good issue because, for one thing, it actually gives this series a premise. In the first 5 issues of this series, collected in Volume 1, we don't get any kind of premise at all. It's just a story with some kids. We don't know what the premise of this series is going to be until the second volume, halfway into the series' life. That's really, really sloppy, if you ask me. But at least we did get an issue that was trying to turn this into something that's a little unique in the world of X-Men. Unfortunately, by then it was probably too little too late, as they didn't last very long after that. This series was canceled with issue 12, and after my review, well, you'll probably see why. There's a character that was introduced in the previous story, but since we knew absolutely nothing about him in that story, I wanted to wait until I did a review on Volume 2 before I talk about him. His name is Graymalkin, and if you know a whole lot about the X-Men, you know that the X-Mansion is actually located on 1407 Graymalkin Lane. So, this guy who looks a whole lot like a monster, he actually was named after the school, right? You'd be wrong. And so would I, since I also didn't see this coming. I'm going to go ahead and reveal everything we know about Graymalkin. He was around in the 1600s, or earlier even, around the time of the Revolutionary War. Now, I haven't looked up the dates of the Revolutionary War, but he mentioned some events that had to do with that. It turns out, at the very end of this book, you find out that he's gay, and his father somehow finds out, and then kills him, I guess, or he thinks he kills him, and then he buries him underground. And as it turns out, his mutant powers manifest right then, and we find out that he's actually stronger at night, or in the dark, and that lightness makes him weaker. So, being underground, that basically put him in a hibernating state for like 400 years. And we are told that when the school blew up in the events of Messiah Complex, that was what brought him out from underground. There's a really huge problem with this. I'm going to consult this book right here. As you can tell, I've used it a lot. It's a very handy tool if you want to learn more about the X-Men. On the article about Xavier's estate. Xavier Mansion has been in Professor X's family for 10 generations, since 1698. During that time, the house has been destroyed and rebuilt a number of times. I haven't even read all of the X-Men books in existence, and honestly, when I tried to think about each time the mansion has been destroyed in the comics, I could only think of one time. and that was near the end of Grant Morrison's run on New X-Men, which ended in 2004. So it seems to me that with the mansion being destroyed and rebuilt numerous times, that at any given point when one of those times happened, Graymalkin should have come out from underground, out of his hibernation then. Why is he only coming out now? What makes the mansion being destroyed this time so special that he comes out from hiding? And you might say, well, Mark Guggenheim has never read an X-Men story, at least that's the claim I made in my previous video, and so maybe he's just unaware that the mansion's been destroyed that many times. However, Guggenheim actually references Grant Morrison's run on New X-Men when he's planting these retcons about a certain character in this story. So, I have to believe that he is at least aware of the mansion being destroyed at least once, and yet we're not given any reason why Graymalkin only comes out from underground now. Comes out because he's gay. Yeah. There's another new character introduced in the previous volume, and like Graymalkin, we know absolutely nothing about her until this volume. In fact, we really don't know that much about her at all, even after this volume. We know that her codename is Cypher, and we know that she's on the run from somebody. We don't actually know who, and since this series was cancelled at issue 12, we're probably never going to find out. I find it very ironic that this character is still around with the X-Men, but she hasn't actually made any significant appearances in any of the comics after the cancellation of this series. Oh well. We get that she's called Cypher because it's a reference to the old character named Cypher. But you know why he was called Cypher? Because he could translate languages. He was omnilingual. He could understand every language. In essence, he was a living cipher. You know why this character's called Cypher? I don't either. Her powers are invisibility. That has absolutely nothing to do with translation and being a cipher. You could call this girl Invisigirl, and that would at least make sense, even if it's a really dumb codename. Yeah, that's a minor nitpick compared to everything else I have in this review. We find out in this book that Cypher has actually secretly been around for a long time, and nobody has known anything about her until this story. You remember that storyline in Joss Whedon's Astonishing X-Men where Wolverine was turned into a little kid mentally and Beast was turned into a beast mentally? Yeah, apparently, according to Mark Guggenheim, Cypher was there in the background helping Blindfold get through it. It's kind of weird since, there's no reason to retcon that story in such a way. You remember in Grant Morrison's run on New X-Men, that one issue where we got to see Zorn writing a letter and talking about how kind of tragic it is being a mutant? At one point, Jean Grey, Scott Summers, and Zorn, they all visited Mutant Town, and there was this kid who looked disgustingly like a mutant, and they were saving him from dying or whatever. Yeah, Mark Guggenheim says that Cypher also came from that ghetto, and for some reason she goes with them and doesn't want anyone at the mansion to even know about her. And then we find out that most recently she was around helping Graymalkin go and infiltrate the X-Men after Messiah Complex in the events of Volume 1 of Young X-Men. Here's a question. Cyclops is basically a really hyped up general. He's never going to ignore any of his assets unless he absolutely has to for the safety of someone else. So I have to ask, for 4 years, Cyclops has known about this character named Cypher, and he's kept her existence a secret from everybody? Why? Think of all the times that having an invisible girl at your disposal could have been helpful ever since the end of Grant Morrison's run on New X-Men. There are lots and lots of times, let me assure you. It makes no kind of sense at all that Cyclops would know about this girl and keep her separate from everyone else in the school when there was so much stuff going on in between her actual introduction in Grant Morrison's run and then her real introduction in Young X-Men. This is really sloppy writing, and I know I'm going to be saying that a lot, but it is. In fact, sloppy is the best way I can describe all of the Young X-Men series. At the beginning of this book, we find out that Danny Moonstar and Roberto da Costa, they are going to be the mentor figures for this team of young students. Cyclops even says that Danny Moonstar needs to find out that even though she doesn't have her powers, she can still be a hero. And Roberto needs to find out that being the Lord Imperial of the Hellfire Club is bad for him and he doesn't need to be there. Okay, where do I even begin? First of all, Dani Moonstar was actually the mentor to these students before. Like, before House of M, when she still had her powers, she and Shan, Karma, they were the mentors to these students. And then Cyclops' girlfriend kicked Dani Moonstar out in a silent panel because basically the school didn't want to have these depowered mutants there anymore. So let me get this straight. Cyclops thinks that Dani Moonstar needs to return to being a mentor figure to this same generation of kids because she needs to find out that she can still be a hero even though she doesn't have her powers. Even though his girlfriend, the co-head mistress of the school, kicked her out because she didn't have her powers. Again, this is why I feel like Mark Guggenheim has never read an X-Men story. Everything he does in this series just feels like he has no idea what's going on. And then you have Roberto da Costa, Sunspot. Now, he was not actually the mentor to these kids the first time around. He was, in fact, the Lord Imperial of the Hellfire Club during Chris Claremont's middle 2000s run on the Uncanny X-Men. I mentioned that in my previous video. Now, first of all, Cyclops is only just now having a problem with Roberto taking this position. He's been there for like 3 years. Ever since around the time of House of M, that was when Roberto became the Lord Imperial. So why is Cyclops only now saying, you know, you don't need to be there? First of all, Roberto isn't even a bad guy, and Cyclops is acting like just setting foot in the building of the Hellfire Club is going to turn him into one. You know, Roberto da Costa being the Lord Imperial of the Hellfire Club, that could have actually had interesting story possibilities. In fact, I would love to have seen a story where Roberto is trying to turn the Hellfire Club into a force for good, and he maybe picks his own inner circle. Something like Angel, Sage, you know, mutants that you can trust. Instead, Cyclops thinks that he can do more good being a babysitter for this team of X-Men who he is still going to send out into battle where they are very likely going to die. First of all, you already had a mentor who could do this, Dani Moonstar and her friend Karma. Karma and Dani both already have experience with some of these kids. They're already very experienced being the mentor figures. So why are we using Roberto? Now, I haven't read a great deal of the old New Mutants series, but as near as I can tell, Dani and Roberto didn't really have that much of a connection with each other. So, as near as I can tell, there wasn't really any reason for him to be here any more than, say, putting Sam on the team would have been. I mean, it just feels like he wants to do something with this character who isn't really on any of the teams, so he comes up with a sloppy reason why he doesn't need to be the Lord Imperial, and so he puts him here as a mentor figure. Even though Karma would probably make more sense because she's done this quite a few times, and she's also basically the guardian of her two younger siblings. This book gives us quite a few instances of Dust going to visit Donald Pierce while he's in prison. And this was maybe the most interesting part of the book, but unfortunately it's still quite flawed. You see, they try to treat the relationship between these two characters kind of like Charles Xavier and Magneto. When she comes to visit, he treats her kind of cordially, and they talk and have pleasant discussions, and then she leaves. So, in a lot of ways, it's like Charles Xavier in the X-Men movies. The problem is, first of all, this character, Dust, does not feel like the character that we've been introduced to. When she was introduced in Grant Morrison's run, and later used in the Kyle and Yost new X-Men run, really, she didn't have much of a characterization at all. She wasn't very wordy, she didn't talk a whole lot unless she was spoken to, and basically she was just kind of the I'll go along with whatever the rest of the team does. She did that a couple of times. And this book, I am convinced, if it kept going, Guggenheim was going to try and turn her into the team leader. Which, I guess when you look at everyone else on the team, it makes sense, but she's not team leader material. Again, why is Cyclops ignoring that there are like 6 other students who are all much more capable of going into battle and stuff than these guys? Surge was the team leader. Heck, you could probably even use the depowered Prodigy as the team leader. Any of them would make a better team leader than this character who we know almost nothing about. So even though I think the dynamic between Donald Pierce and Dust is kind of interesting, unfortunately it spits in the characterization or lack of characterization of Dust that we had gotten so far. In fact, while I'm complaining about Dust being written as if she was a different character, she was kind of written this way in the first volume, and I probably should have brought this up in my review then. When we first see her in Volume 1, she actually rips the skin off a member of the Taliban's hand. And while that's kind of a cool scene, it doesn't really make any sense, especially when we see in Messiah Complex that Dust is completely against using her powers for vengeance whenever they go to kill some purifiers. She doesn't go with that group because she's against it. So why, in the span of weeks, is she going and ripping the skin off of someone in the Taliban? Again, I have to assume that Guggenheim has never read an X-Men comic, and all of these references to past stories are just things that he knows about on the surface, but he doesn't really get these characters in any way that matters. This book ends on a story that's maybe one of the worst X-Men things I've ever read, and I don't really know where to place the blame. On the one hand, this whole series was pretty much a disappointment, but on the other hand, this series was probably canceled prematurely, so any ideas that Guggenheim was probably trying to work with, he didn't really have enough time to do that because this series ended with issue 12. The story I'm talking about is, for lack of a better title, I'm going to call it The Dark Dust Saga. And for 2 issues, we see a far-off future where this team of young X-Men is somehow the only ones left alive after all of the mutants in the world have been killed. And what we have here, we have Grey Malkin, we have Anole, we have Wolverine, we have Emma Frost, and as it turns out, her husband, Ink, in a wheelchair. Okay, this is all kinds of disturbing and just gross. Ink is a teenager in this series in the present day. Emma Frost is in her 30s. So even if she waited like 15 years, it's still really gross to see these two as a couple in a dark future. And honestly, I don't see why it's there. I mean, Ink doesn't really talk until the very end of this series, in this dark future anyway, and there was no reason for Emma to refer to him as darling the once or twice that she even talks to him in this dark future. Honestly, it's just there for, I don't even know why. It's not there for any reason as near as I can tell. So anyway, then we find out that it's actually Dust who has been killing all the mutants, and she's come to kill all of these guys. And somehow, she's able to kill Wolverine by stripping all the flesh from his bones, even though we saw, around the time of Civil War, that Wolverine can survive that very thing. Now, I should go ahead and point out that I didn't like it then, because that itself was spitting in the face of Days of Future Past. But what we need is some consistency. Can Wolverine survive having all the flesh ripped from his bones, either by Sentinels or by Dust or by Nitro in Civil War? There really needs to be some kind of consistency here, and this was so soon after Civil War, I really, again, feel like that Mark Guggenheim doesn't know what he's doing. So anyway, Dust doesn't even resemble the character that we've come to know all this time, as she's not wearing a burqa or a robe. She's wearing some weird skin-tight uniform that probably looks like it should be worn by Selene of the Hellfire Club. And then we go back to the present day. And it turns out, when Dust was turned into glass in Volume 1, when Magma used her heat on her, that process, even though she was turned back into a human who can turn into sand, that's slowly killing her. Now, we don't really know why this is happening, and it seems to me that since Elixir is still alive as of Messiah Complex, that means that Beast, who knows about Soraya's condition, he could have just gone and got Elixir and then healed Soraya. Why are they acting like this is a really complex disease that's going to kill her in a week, when they could just take a couple hours to go find Elixir and heal her? This is fundamentally wrong in every way. And we jump back to the future and we find out that Dust is an evil, talkative supervillain because when she died in the present day, Ink somehow used his Phoenix Force tattoo to heal her, and then I guess she lost her soul or something. Again, I don't really think we can technically blame Mark Guggenheim here, because if the series had gone on a little longer, I'm sure he would have played out this story arc a little more. I'm sure it still would have been bad, but at least he would have developed it a little bit. Even though Elixir is a healer who could have healed her without doing any damage to himself, Guggenheim pretends that that character doesn't exist. And so while Dust is laying on the morgue table, going to be autopsied or whatever, Ink goes in and he uses his tattoo to basically do whatever the plot needs him to do. So then Soraya is healed. And Ink, he's on the floor comatose, and everyone is having a big happy party because even though one of their teammates is now in a coma, their other teammate is now back on her feet. And as near as I can tell, absolutely nothing happens in this timeline to change the fact that in the future, Dust is going to become an evil supervillain. Years and years from now, when Dust is not an evil, soulless supervillain, people are going to look back on Volume 2 of Young X-Men and they're going to say, hey, what was it that changed about this timeline so that she didn't go down that path? And the best answer I can say is nothing. Nothing at all changes in this book. In fact, Ink being comatose kind of leads you to believe that that dark future is going to happen. Except that Young X-Men was canceled, Mark Guggenheim is no longer writing any of the X-Men books, and I imagine even the other writers who I don't much care for probably thought that this idea for a story was really dumb, so they're just going to ignore it and pretend it never happened. And I wish there was some part of me that could say, yeah, I also wish this never happened. I certainly wish it never happened, but it did happen. And while it's a little late to go back and try and retcon that in some way so that Soraya doesn't become a talkative supervillain, it also seems to me that you can't just leave that hanging in such a way. There should have been some kind of reference, like time-traveling Ink from the future comes back in time and does something to alter the timeline. It might be a little evocative of Days of Future Past, but at least it would fix this huge, glaring plot hole in this book. I know there's a lot more that I could talk about here, like the character of Ink, who I feel like Guggenheim was trying to do the most with, but honestly, all I can say is, if you are curious about this book, just like Volume 1, I'm going to have to recommend you do not pick this up. In a lot of ways, it's pretty easy to skip these two books because they don't really have any kind of impact on the rest of the X-World. It's not like an arc of Uncanny X-Men, which influences the next arc of Uncanny X-Men. This was just a 12-issue series that everyone else in the X-Men universe is pretending like never happened. We've never seen Graymalkin, we've never seen Cypher, and we haven't really seen Ink since this series ended. Basically, the only thing that writers are doing is going on pretending like this didn't happen. And if they're going to pretend like it didn't happen, I'm going to have to pretend like it didn't happen too, hard as that may be. With that being said, that's all I have to say for now. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I don't really have a witty remark, so I'm just going to say, I'll see you next time.